In this video, I'm going to show you how to grease the Carlton 7015. But before we do so, I want to explain why we grease. We use grease to reduce friction because friction creates heat. And where there's heat, we can warp metal. So anytime there's metal parts that are where there's metal on metal, we want to reduce the friction in order to reduce the heat, in order to reduce the chance of destroying the bearing or whatever the part is. So greasing is very important. If you understand that concept, it makes it easy to find grease points on just about any kind of machine. If you know you're looking for rotating metal parts, there will typically be a grease fitting there. So we start with the engine, which is what generates the power that drives the cutter wheel. From the engine to the cutter wheel, we know there are a series of belts and moving parts. We've learned this in our parts and performance training. So the engine turns a shaft that turns the V-belt. This is a rotating bearing. If we look here, sure enough, we see a grease fitting. This grease fitting needs to be greased once per week when we take off the belt cover to perform our weekly maintenance. In addition, we find a grease fitting outside of the V-belt cover right here. This one needs to be greased daily, very important. The V-belt transfers power to the jack shaft bearings. These bearings rotate, they have grease points. There are 2 grease points on the top of each bearing. These grease points need to be greased daily. That's also very important. The jack shaft bearings transfer power to the poly chain belt, which turns the cutter wheel. This is a wheel. It's mounted on 2 bearings. As we'd expect, these bearings have grease points. Grease point on the left side, grease point on the right side. These are your most important grease points. They have to be greased every 2 to 3 hours of operating time. It doesn't mean 2 to 3 hours of you on the clock, that means 2 to 3 hours of machine time, typically once to twice a day. In addition to these bearings that are moving at thousands of rotations per minute, we also have a series of movements, again, metal on metal, but they're not quite as dramatic. We have the turntable assembly, which is pivoting left and right, left and right. It is metal on metal, so we should expect to find grease bearings. And as you'll see, there are a series of grease points located around the bottom of the turntable assembly. These should also be greased daily, approximately 5 pumps per day. Last but not least, this engine slides along 2 rails when we engage it and disengage. The rails are metal on metal, once again, and here we find 3 grease points and a 4th on the upper deck. These should be greased once a week, or as needed. You can just visually see how much grease there is. There's a mirror image of these points on the other side of the machine. It is very important that you grease the machine according to the schedule. If you do not grease, you could cause catastrophic damage. One quick word about how to grease. For most of these bearings, you're going to grease until they purge, which means you'll actually see grease pushing out of the seam of the bearing or coming out of some location. That's not true for all bearings, but many you'll be greasing until they purge.